Pressure's dropping too fast. Watch the stern planes.
I'm on it. Holding steady at 150.
Steady on course. Keep her at 50 meters.
Aye, Captain.
Over there, sir. Wake on the port side.
I see it. Hard to starboard.
January 1942, North Atlantic. The Atlantic is black and restless. Wind presses hard against steel. Waves strike the hull with dull, rhythmic force. Deep below the surface, a German U-boat moves in near silence. Inside the pressure hull, the air is stale. Diesel fumes linger in the metal seams. Men whisper, not out of fear but habit. Every sound matters here. Boots avoid the deck plates. Tools are secured. Even breath is measured. For years, this darkness has been protection. Depth has meant safety. Silence has meant survival. The commander stands beneath a red lamp, eyes fixed on the depth gauge. 200 feet. Steady. No propellers above. No explosions. The ocean feels empty. Then, a sound breaks the calm. Not an explosion. Not engines. A sharp, mechanical pulse cuts through the hull. It returns again, and again. The men freeze. This is not luck. This is not guesswork. Somewhere above them, unseen and untouched by darkness, an enemy is listening. The ocean itself has begun to speak. What once concealed the hunters now betrays them. And in this moment, beneath thousands of tons of water, the balance of the Atlantic war begins to shift. Quietly, precisely, and without mercy. That shift did not begin here, but this is where it became unavoidable. The war beneath the waves begins. When the Second World War erupted in September 1939, it did not begin with tank columns or aerial armadas alone. It began quietly, on shipping lanes beneath the surface of the sea, far from public view. For Germany, the Atlantic was never simply an ocean. It was a battlefield that decided survival. The British Empire depended on imports. Food from Canada, oil from the Americas, raw materials from across the world. Without uninterrupted shipping, Britain would starve long before an invasion fleet ever crossed the channel. German naval planners understood this with brutal clarity. They did not need to defeat the Royal Navy in open battle. They only needed to sever Britain's lifeline. At the center of this strategy stood the Unterseeboot, the U-boat. German submarine doctrine was shaped by memory. During the First World War, U-boats had nearly forced Britain to the negotiating table by sinking merchant shipping faster than it could be replaced. Although unrestricted submarine warfare had provoked the United States into entering that war, the operational lesson remained powerful. Submarines were asymmetric weapons. Cheap compared to battleships. Difficult to detect. Lethal when used correctly. By the late 1930s, Grand Admiral Karl Donitz became the architect of a renewed submarine campaign. Donitz rejected the idea of lone raiders acting independently. Instead, he envisioned coordinated attacks, riddle tactic, or wolf pack tactics, where U-boats shadowed convoys and struck together under cover of darkness. Early in the war, this doctrine worked. British convoy escorts were stretched thin. Destroyers were few. Aircraft lacked range. Merchant crews were often untrained for combat conditions. Many convoys crossed vast ocean gaps without air cover or consistent protection. At night, U-boats surfaced, becoming fast, maneuverable attackers rather than slow underwater vessels. Torpedoes struck without warning. Ships burned. Crews abandoned vessel after vessel into freezing seas. In 1940 and 1941, losses mounted relentlessly. Hundreds of thousands of tons of Allied shipping disappeared beneath the waves. The Atlantic became a graveyard marked not by headstones, but by coordinates. Yet beneath this apparent German advantage lay an older fear, one born not in Berlin, but in London. During the First World War, Britain had been caught unprepared for submarine warfare. Depth charges were crude. Detection relied on eyesight, luck, and the sound of propellers through water. Too often, submarines vanished before retaliation could be organized. The war ended before a decisive technological answer could fully mature. But the problem was never forgotten. Between the wars, British naval scientists worked in quiet urgency. They understood that the ocean was not truly silent. Sound traveled farther underwater than in air. Steel hulls displaced water. Propellers produced distinct acoustic signatures. The challenge was not theory, it was precision. This effort culminated in a system known as ASTIC. Developed in the late 1920s and early 1930s, ASTIC was an early form of active sonar. It functioned by emitting sound pulses into the water and listening for their echoes when they struck a solid object. Submarines, once invisible below the surface, could now be located by reflected sound. Range, bearing, and movement could be estimated if conditions were right. Before the war, ASTIC was treated cautiously. It was imperfect. It struggled in rough seas. It lost contact at close range. Skilled submarine commanders could still evade it through maneuver and depth. Most importantly, many British officers overestimated its effectiveness, assuming it was a near-complete solution. It was not. When war began, ASTIC-equipped escorts remained too few. Training was inconsistent. Coordination between ships was limited. Convoys were often protected by outdated tactics that assumed submarines would remain submerged, an assumption U-boat commanders exploited mercilessly by attacking on the surface. Still, something fundamental had changed. For the first time in naval history, submarines were no longer completely blind to detection beneath the sea. The ocean was becoming measurable, trackable, interpretable. The Germans knew of British ASTIC. Intelligence reports mentioned it. Captured documents referenced it. But early successes led many within the U-boat arm to dismiss it as exaggerated or unreliable. Depth, silence, and experience continued to protect them, at least for now. What neither side fully grasped in 1939 was that this contest would not be decided by torpedoes alone. It would be decided by engineering, industrial scale, and the ability to turn scientific theory into operational reality, faster than the enemy could adapt. And across the Atlantic, a nation not yet formally at war was already watching closely, learning from Britain's struggle, studying its failures, and preparing to refine what had begun as an experimental tool into something far more decisive. Because the next phase of the Atlantic War would not be fought only with steel and explosives, but with sound itself. America enters the silent war. By the time the Atlantic War reached its most dangerous phase, the United States was already involved, long before it officially declared war. From 1939 onward, American naval observers followed Britain's struggle with growing concern. Reports crossing the Atlantic painted a stark picture. Convoys burning at sea, escorts overwhelmed, submarines slipping away untouched beneath the waves. For Washington, the lesson was unavoidable. If Britain fell, the Atlantic would become a hostile frontier overnight. President Franklin D. Roosevelt understood that geography alone no longer guaranteed safety. The ocean was no longer a buffer. It was a battleground. Even before Pearl Harbor, American destroyers began escorting convoys partway across the Atlantic. U.S. naval yards expanded production. Research laboratories accelerated development. Quietly, the United States Navy began preparing for a war it knew was coming. At the center of this preparation stood underwater detection. British ASTIC provided a foundation, but American engineers quickly identified its limitations. Early systems were bulky. Displays were imprecise. Interpretation relied heavily on operator experience. In combat, seconds mattered, and seconds were often lost to uncertainty. The U.S. Navy sought not merely to copy ASTIC, but to industrialize and refine it. American sonar development accelerated through institutions such as the Naval Research Laboratory and university-linked acoustic programs. The physics of sound propagation in saltwater, temperature layers, salinity gradients, and depth-induced refraction were studied with scientific rigor. What had once been a specialist tool was reshaped into a standardized weapon system. The result was the emergence of American active sonar, built for mass deployment. It was not flawless, but it was reliable. Training programs were formalized. Operators learned to distinguish whales from submarines, surface ships from underwater contacts. Recognition replaced guesswork. Equally important was doctrine. Early in the war, escorts tended to break contact after an attack, allowing submarines to escape. American and British tacticians began developing coordinated hunter-killer tactics. Instead of reacting passively to attacks, escort groups now pursued contacts aggressively, maintaining sonar lock while rotating ships to sustain pressure. The ocean became a cage rather than an escape route. Aircraft extended this reach further. Long-range patrol bombers, working in coordination with surface escorts, forced U-boats to remain submerged for longer periods, reducing speed, draining batteries, and increasing vulnerability to detection. Sonar did not operate alone. It became part of a layered system of surveillance and attack. After December 7, 1941, the war expanded instantly. German submarines moved toward the American coastline, launching Operation Pockenschlag, the so-called Second Happy Time. U-boats found unprotected shipping, brightly lit cities, and inexperienced defenses. Sinking surged. Tankers burned within sight of shore. Once again, German commanders believed the Atlantic favored them. But this time, the advantage was temporary. The United States responded with industrial force. Shipyards worked without pause. Destroyer escorts, corvettes, and patrol craft were launched in staggering numbers. Each carried sonar. Each crew was trained not only to listen, but to understand what they heard. Convoy systems were established along the eastern seaboard. Blackouts darkened coastal cities. Merchant shipping adapted. Most critically, coordination replaced chaos. Where U-boats once hunted isolated targets, they now faced organized resistance. By 1942, American sonar technology had matured into a decisive tool. Improvements in transducer design increased detection range. Signal processing became clearer. Sonar operators developed confidence, not in luck, but in instrumentation. The ocean was no longer an unknowable void. For German crews, the change was unsettling. Reports began filtering back to U-boat headquarters. Submarines were being held down for hours. Depth charge patterns were becoming unervingly accurate. Escorts no longer guessed where a submarine might be. They knew. The sea itself had become hostile. Admiral Donitz recognized a shift, but solutions were limited. Countermeasures lagged behind Allied production. New submarine designs were promised, but not yet available. For the men at sea, doctrine offered little comfort against a technology that could pierce darkness and depth alike. By the end of 1942, the Atlantic War was no longer defined by surprise. It was defined by detection. And as sonar transformed from experimental equipment into an omnipresent threat, the U-boat arm began to confront a reality it had long avoided. The era of invulnerability beneath the waves was ending. This realization would be felt not only in command briefings and loss statistics, but inside the steel hulls themselves, where fear now traveled faster than torpedoes. For the men of the German U-boat service, war at sea was never heroic in the way propaganda posters suggested. It was claustrophobic, exhausting, and relentlessly tense. Crews lived inside steel cylinders no wider than a railway carriage. Condensation dripped from pipes. Diesel fumes mixed with sweat and unwashed clothing. Fresh air was a luxury measured in minutes, not hours. Early in the war, depth provided comfort. When threatened, a submarine could dive and disappear. Escorts passed overhead. The sea absorbed sound. Time worked in the submarine's favor. Even when depth charges detonated nearby, survival often depended on endurance rather than detection. Crews waited, listened, endured. Sonar changed that psychology completely. By 1942, U-boat sailors began to describe a new fear, not of explosions, but of being found. The ping of active sonar was unmistakable. It cut through the hull like a metallic heartbeat. Each pulse meant the enemy was not guessing. Each echo meant the submarine's position was known. Hours-long chases became common. Depth charges no longer fell randomly. Patterns tightened. The water pressure intensified. Lights flickered. Instruments failed. Men held their breath as escorts above tracked every movement. This was not panic, it was erosion. Morale did not collapse suddenly. It wore away patrol by patrol. Veterans later recalled that silence had once belonged to them. Now, silence worked against them. Every maneuver altered sound. Every attempt to escape left an acoustic trace. The ocean itself felt hostile, no longer neutral, no longer protective. The psychological toll was profound. Crews returned from patrols changed. Younger sailors aged rapidly. Confidence gave way to caution. Aggression turned into survival instinct. The U-boat war was no longer about hunting. It was about enduring pursuit. And endurance had limits. Sonar was not a single invention. It was a system, one that merged physics, engineering, and operational discipline. At its core, active sonar functioned by emitting controlled sound pulses and measuring the returning echoes. But beneath that simplicity lay immense complexity. Water temperature created layers that bent sound waves. Salinity altered propagation. Sea state introduced interference. Skilled operators learned to interpret subtle changes, shadows, distortions, delays. American sonar improved consistency. Equipment became rugged, displays clearer, training standardized. Sonar operators were no longer improvisers, they were specialists. Crews drilled relentlessly. Mistakes were analyzed. Contacts were logged and compared. Most importantly, sonar was integrated with weapons. Depth charges were calibrated to sonar estimates. Later, ahead-throwing weapons reduced the sonar blind spot that once allowed submarines to slip beneath attacking ships. Detection and destruction became parts of the same sequence. Technology did not replace sailors, it amplified them. Each escort ship became a listening post. Each convoy a moving sensor array. When sonar gained contact, the ocean itself narrowed. Space disappeared. Escape routes collapsed. For the first time in naval history, underwater warfare became systematic rather than speculative. Early convoy escorts reacted to attacks. By 1943, they controlled engagements. Sonar enabled this shift. Instead of scattering after an attack, escorts now stayed together. They held contact. Ships rotated positions to maintain pressure while conserving fuel and crew stamina. Submarines were forced deeper, slower, and into predictable movement patterns. Tactics became relentless. No single explosion mattered. What mattered was time. Hours submerged meant depleted batteries. Reduced speed meant vulnerability. Eventually, the submarine had to surface or be destroyed below. The sea was no longer vast. It was mapped by sound. This transformation did not come suddenly. It emerged through loss, analysis, and adaptation. But once established, it reshaped the Atlantic War permanently. And while German commanders searched desperately for counters, the balance had already shifted, quietly, decisively, and without spectacle. That shift was not merely technical. It was strategic, and it reached far beyond the men at sea. Admiral Karl Donitz was not blind to change. He He read patrol reports carefully. He tracked loss curves. He understood trends. But leadership in wartime is often defined not by what is known, but by what can be changed. Donitz had built the U-boat arm around aggression, initiative, and tactical flexibility. Wolf packs relied on surprise and coordination, not brute force. When Sonar began eroding those foundations, the response options were limited. New submarine designs, faster, deeper diving, more automated, were already on drawing boards. But war does not wait for blueprints to become steel. Allied leadership, by contrast, had time and scale. American and British commanders emphasized integration. No single ship fought alone. Intelligence, air patrols, surface escorts, and sonar operators functioned as parts of a unified system. Losses were studied, not hidden. Failures produced adjustments rather than excuses. The contrast was stark. German leadership sought technical salvation in future platforms. Allied leadership focused on maximizing what already existed, training crews harder, coordinating forces tighter, and standardizing procedures across thousands of vessels. The result was asymmetry not in technology alone, but in adaptability. For German submariners, sonar created an invisible enemy. They could not see it. They could not destroy it directly. They could only endure it. Earlier in the war, escorts were feared only when close. Now, fear began at long range. A sonar contact meant pursuit before any weapon was fired. Even when depth charges missed, their message was clear. Escape was temporary. Interrogations of captured U-boat crews revealed a consistent theme: disorientation. Escorts seemed to know where the submarine was going before it arrived. Maneuvers that once guaranteed evasion now failed without explanation. The ocean, once predictable, felt hostile and alive. This perception mattered. Warfare is not only physical, it is psychological. Confidence erodes long before hulls do. Submarine commanders grew cautious. Attacks were delayed. Opportunities passed. The hunter hesitated, not because of weakness, but because certainty had vanished. By late 1942, the moral equation of U-boat war began to shift. Early patrols carried a sense of purpose. Crews believed they were striking decisive blows. Losses were accepted as the cost of success. But as sinkings declined and casualties mounted, justification weakened. Sonar made survival uncertain even without combat. Crews could do everything correctly and still be destroyed. There was no duel, no visible opponent, only detection, pursuit, and exhaustion. Letters home changed tone. Confidence softened. Fatalism crept in. For Allied crews, the moral pressure moved in the opposite direction. Sonar gave reassurance. It turned fear into procedure. Sailors trusted instruments. Training replaced superstition. The unseen enemy became manageable, not through courage alone, but through method. This imbalance of belief mattered. Wars are not won when one side loses weapons. They are won when one side loses conviction. By early 1943, that moment was approaching, when detection became dominance and dominance became decision. 1943, the Atlantic turns. By the opening months of 1943, the Battle of the Atlantic reached its breaking point. For nearly 4 years, German U-boats had shaped the tempo of the war at sea. They had forced Britain into defensive posture. They had threatened supply lines stretching from North America to the Soviet Union. They had dictated where and when Allied shipping could move. Now, that control began to dissolve. The change was not announced. There was no single battle that marked the shift. Instead, it revealed itself through patterns, losses that no longer made sense to German commanders, and victories that no longer surprised Allied escorts. Convoys crossing the North Atlantic were now enveloped by layers of protection. Long-range aircraft closed the once dangerous mid-ocean gap. Escort carriers extended air cover. Destroyer escorts designed specifically for submarine hunting, filled convoy screens. Each carried sonar, reliable, trained, and used continuously. Detection became constant. U-boats attempting to shadow convoys were found before attacks could be coordinated. Radio transmissions, once essential to wolfpack tactics, became liabilities. Escorts homed in on contacts with increasing speed. What had once been a vast ocean shrank into a confined battle space. Sonar operators worked in shifts, ears tuned to subtle variations in returning echoes. They learned to recognize evasive maneuvers, decoys, and changes in depth. Contact reports grew precise. Bearings tightened. Time between detection and attack shortened. Depth charge attacks evolved into sustained hunts. Instead of single passes, escorts now executed rolling patterns, forcing submarines deeper, slower, and into predictable courses. Sonar maintained contact even as explosions shook the water. The submarine's greatest defense, depth, became a trap. German patrol reports from early 1943 reflect this change with chilling clarity. Commanders describe being held down for entire days. Batteries drained, air fouled, mechanical failures multiplied under pressure. Some boats surfaced at night only to be driven under again by radar-directed escorts, coordinating with sonar-equipped ships. In March 1943, losses surged. Entire wolf packs disappeared. Donitz committed more boats, believing mass could overwhelm defenses. Instead, it compounded the disaster. Concentrated U-boat formations presented more targets to an enemy that could now hear them coming. The Atlantic had become transparent. Allied escorts no longer hunted blindly. They controlled engagements. When a submarine was detected, escape was no longer assumed. It had to be earned, and increasingly, it could not be. This was the moment when technology crossed into dominance. Not through spectacle, not through sudden annihilation, but through inevitability. And as U-boats vanished beneath the waves in growing numbers, German commanders faced a realization more dangerous than any depth charge. The system that had once given them superiority was now working against them. The second half of 1943 would confirm what this moment suggested, that the age of the U-boat as master of the Atlantic was ending. Collapsed beneath the surface. By late spring of 1943, the truth could no longer be contained within reports and statistics. It was visible on operations boards in loss curves and in the empty spaces where submarines should have returned. The German U-boat fleet was breaking. In May 1943 alone, more than 40 U-boats were destroyed, an unsustainable loss rate that stunned even seasoned naval planners. Boats vanished without firing torpedoes. Others were destroyed during withdrawal, hunted relentlessly from first contact to final detonation. Survivors spoke of escorts that never disengaged, of sonar contact that never faded. For the first time, the submarine was no longer dictating the terms of battle. Allied forces had achieved what earlier generations considered impossible: continuous underwater contact. Sonar no longer lost targets during attack runs. Improved coordination allowed one ship to hold contact while others maneuvered to strike. Aircraft forced submarines down. Surface escorts closed in. The sea offered no refuge. Technological layers overlapped seamlessly. Radar detected surfaced boats at night. High-frequency direction finding trace transmissions. Sonar fixed positions below the surface. Each tool reinforced the others. None worked in isolation. For U-boat commanders, every decision carried risk. Dive early and lose speed. Stay surfaced and risk detection. Transmit orders and reveal location. Remain silent and lose coordination. There are no safe choices, only less dangerous ones. Admiral Donitz confronted the numbers. Sinkings no longer justified losses. Crews were irreplaceable. Morale was eroding faster than production could compensate. Promised revolutionary submarines remained months away from deployment. In May 1943, Donitz made the unthinkable decision. He withdrew the majority of U-boats from the North Atlantic. It was not defeat in the traditional sense. German submarines continued operating elsewhere. New technologies were pursued. But the strategic offensive, the campaign to strangle Britain, was over. The turning point had passed. Allied shipping losses dropped sharply. Convoys moved with growing confidence. Supplies flowed to Britain, to North Africa, to the Soviet Union. The Atlantic ceased to be a barrier and became a bridge. Sonar did not win the war alone, but made victory possible. It transformed uncertainty into control, fear into procedure, darkness into data. For the men who listened through headphones, staring at oscillating lines and echo returns, the change was profound. They were no longer reacting to an unseen enemy. They were shaping the battle before it began. And beneath the waves, the silence that once protected German U-boats became the quiet of abandonment, an emptiness where dominance once lived. The consequences of this collapse would extend far beyond the Atlantic, reshaping naval warfare and the outcome of the war itself. The cost of being heard. The decision to withdraw German U-boats from the North Atlantic in 1943 did not end the Battle of the Atlantic, but it ended the illusion that Germany could still win it. What followed was not sudden silence, but a measurable shift, one recorded in shipping tables, patrol reports, and the absence of familiar hull numbers from return lists. The ocean did not erupt in celebration. It simply stopped favoring the hunter. By mid-1943, Allied anti-submarine warfare had reached a level of efficiency never before seen. Sonar was no longer experimental, auxiliary, or dependent on individual brilliance. It had become institutionalized. Every convoy escort operated within a framework of detection, pursuit, and destruction that left little room for chance. German losses tell the story with brutal honesty. Between January and May 1943, U-boat losses reached catastrophic levels. Entire patrol groups were erased. In May alone, more than 40 submarines were destroyed, many without firing a single torpedo. These were not isolated defeats. They were systematic failures occurring across vast ocean spaces, often far from land, often without witnesses. Each lost boat represented more than steel and machinery. A typical U-boat carried 40 to 50 men. When a submarine failed to return, there were rarely survivors. Families received notices without bodies to bury. Ports that once welcomed returning crews grew quieter. Familiar faces vanished from mess halls and training depots. The psychological effect within the U-boat arm was severe. Veteran commanders, men who had survived multiple patrols in earlier years, recognized that the balance had changed irrevocably. Skill, daring, and experience could no longer guarantee survival. New crews sensed it immediately. They entered service not with confidence, but with resignation. Patrols were no longer framed as missions to strike the enemy, but as ordeals to be endured. Admiral Karl Donitz faced an impossible equation. The strategic logic of submarine warfare remained sound on paper. Britain still depended on shipping. Allied production still required protection. But numbers no longer favored persistence. Sinkings no longer justified losses. Training pipelines could not replace crews at the rate they were being lost. The withdrawal from the North Atlantic was therefore not an admission of defeat, but an act of damage control. German submarines were redeployed to less defended areas. Efforts intensified to develop new technologies, improve batteries, streamline hulls, acoustic countermeasures, and advanced designs capable of higher underwater speeds. Yet these measures addressed symptoms rather than causes. The fundamental problem remained unchanged. The Allies could now hear. For the Allies, the aftermath unfolded differently. The decline in shipping losses brought a sense of cautious relief. Convoys that once crossed the Atlantic under constant threat now arrived with regularity. Insurance rates dropped. Scheduling stabilized. Ports planned months ahead rather than days. The war at sea became predictable. This predictability enabled scale. By late 1943, the Allies were moving unprecedented volumes of material across the Atlantic. Tanks, trucks, artillery, aircraft components, fuel, and millions of tons of supplies flowed steadily toward Britain and the Mediterranean. The logistical foundation for future operations, most notably the invasion of Western Europe, was laid quietly, convoy by convoy. Sonar played a central role in this transformation. It did not operate alone. Radar, air patrols, intelligence, and escort carriers all contributed. But sonar provided continuity. It allowed escorts to maintain contact beneath the surface, turning fleeting encounters into sustained engagements. It denied submarines the one advantage they had always relied upon: invisibility. Escort crews internalized this change. Confidence replaced anxiety. Training emphasized repetition and discipline. Sonar operators were no longer peripheral specialists. They were central to every action. Their assessments shaped decisions, movements, and attacks. This shift altered naval culture. Before sonar dominance, anti-submarine warfare had often felt reactive and uncertain. After 1943, it became methodical. Engagements followed patterns. Outcomes became statistically predictable. The ocean ceased to be mysterious and became operational. German commanders understood this as well. Capture documents and post-war interrogations reveal a growing sense of inevitability within the U-boat arm. Countermeasures were attempted, but few offered lasting relief. Noise-making devices confused sonar briefly. Tactical changes bought minutes, not hours. Deeper dives strained hulls. Higher speeds drained batteries. Each solution created new vulnerabilities. The submarine, once the apex predator of the Atlantic, had been forced into a defensive crouch. Losses continued throughout the remainder of the war, even as operational tempo decreased. Every patrol carried disproportionate risk. Every mission faced an enemy that no longer needed luck. By 1944, the Atlantic was effectively secured. This security did not eliminate danger, but it changed the nature of risk. Merchant sailors still faced storms, accidents, and occasional attack. Yet the existential threat, the possibility that shipping losses could cripple Allied war efforts, had passed. That achievement was not dramatic. It produced no iconic photographs. It generated no decisive battlefield moment. But it mattered more than many victories celebrated at the time. The defeat of the U-boat threat ensured that armies could move, that air forces could be supplied, and that industrial power could be converted into combat power without interruption. It was the unseen victory that made visible victories possible. And at the heart of that outcome was sound, measured, interpreted, and acted upon with relentless precision. The Atlantic did not become safer because submarines disappeared. It became safer because they could no longer hide. The long shadow of sound. The collapse of the U-boat threat in the North Atlantic reshaped not only the immediate course of the war, but also the future of naval warfare. Once Germany's submarines were forced to retreat, the Allies were free to consolidate, innovate, and expand their control over the seas. Convoys crossed the ocean with reduced losses. Escort groups became templates for future operations. The Atlantic, which had once been a theater dominated by stealth and fear, became a laboratory in which the Allies refined techniques that would define modern anti-submarine warfare for decades. American industrial capacity played a decisive role in this transformation. Hundreds of new destroyers, corvettes, and escort vessels flooded the Atlantic. Each ship was equipped with the latest sonar technology, depth-charge projectors, and, increasingly, ahead-throwing weapons such as hedgehog mortars. These allowed for more precise attacks on submarines, increasing effectiveness while reducing risk to the attacking ship. Training programs were expanded, creating crews capable of operating as cohesive, disciplined units rather than relying on improvisation. Sonar operators became experts in acoustic profiling, learning to distinguish between genuine contacts, marine life, and decoys. This combination of equipment, numbers, and human skill ensured that the advantage would remain with the Allies for the rest of the war. The psychological impact on the U-boat arm was equally profound. Crews returned from patrols disillusioned, worn, and deeply aware that they were no longer the hunters but the hunted. Entire generations of submariners were forced to operate in fear, knowing that even flawless execution could end in death. Commanders like Donitz were left grappling with a technological reality that could not be countered simply by tactics or courage. For the Germans, the ocean was no longer a sanctuary, but a battleground controlled by an enemy they could hear but rarely see. This technological dominance had broader strategic consequences. With the Atlantic supply lines secure, the Allies were able to launch major operations with confidence. Material, troops, and equipment flowed steadily to Britain, North Africa, and eventually into preparations for the Normandy invasion. The logistical backbone of the Allied war effort was no longer at risk from submarine interdiction. Air and land campaigns could now operate with a predictable supply chain, something unimaginable in 1940 or 1941. The lessons learned during the Battle of the Atlantic influenced naval doctrine long after the war. Sonar technology became a permanent feature of post-war fleets, and anti-submarine tactics evolved into a central component of naval strategy. Nations recognized that mastery of the underwater environment could determine the outcome of conflicts before surface battles ever began. Submarine designers, once the masters of stealth, were forced to innovate in response to sonar, creating faster, quieter, and deeper diving vessels. Sonar and countersonar technology entered a technological arms race that would last throughout the Cold War and beyond. Equally important was the integration of technology and human skill. The Allies demonstrated that sophisticated instruments were only as effective as the crews trained to use them. Coordination between ships, aircraft, and intelligence networks transformed naval engagements into multidimensional operations. Sound, once invisible and impenetrable, had become an operational weapon. Its effectiveness depended not only on the quality of equipment, but on the discipline, vigilance, and judgment of those who wielded it. The end result was the permanent transformation of naval warfare. The Atlantic had once been a theater of uncertainty, where a few submarines could wreak disproportionate havoc. After 1943, it became a space where careful planning, technological innovation, and operational discipline dictated outcomes. The era of the invincible submarine was over. Silent waters were no longer a guarantee of safety. The lessons learned in these months would echo for decades, influencing both strategy and technology around the world. And yet, the story of sonar and the U-boat war is also a human story. It is a story of courage measured against inevitability, of adaptation against relentless pressure, and of the profound ways in which technology can alter the psychology, decisions, and fates of those who fight. By transforming the ocean into a space that could be monitored, measured, and controlled, sonar reshaped the balance of power, not merely in terms of ships or tonnage, but in the confidence and survival of men on both sides of the conflict. The Atlantic's transformation was complete. Where once German submarines had moved like ghosts beneath the waves, they now faced a universe of sound that betrayed every movement. The tide had turned not through grand battles alone, but through the persistent, invisible power of sonar, an invention that quietly ensured the survival of convoys, the success of armies, and the eventual victory of the Allies. In the end, the war beneath the waves had proven that invisibility, once a weapon, could be undone by science, perseverance, and the discipline to listen carefully to the voice of the ocean itself. Wind silence, no longer protected. The story of the Atlantic is a story of transformation, not just of ships and weapons, but of perception itself. For centuries, the ocean had offered a kind of refuge. Its depths concealed fleets. Its vastness protected those who moved quietly beneath the surface. The U-boat once exploited that silence to devastating effect, turning stealth into a weapon. By 1943, silence had become a liability. The Allies had learned to listen. They had turned sound into intelligence, intelligence into action, and action into dominance. What was once hidden was now measurable. What was once unknowable could be controlled. In this shift lay the true genius of sonar. Not in invention alone, but in integration, training, doctrine, coordination, and relentless application. For the men of both sides, the consequences were deeply human. U-boat crews faced fear that could not be outrun, a constant awareness that even skill could not guarantee survival. Allied sailors gained confidence not from luck, but from mastery of tools and procedure. The Atlantic War was no longer defined by chance encounters or random survival. It was defined by preparation, discipline, and the persistent edge that technology provided. The legacy extended far beyond the war. Sonar became a permanent element of naval operations. Anti-submarine tactics evolved into a science. Submarine designers, once unchallenged, had to innovate in response to detection. Future conflicts, most notably during the Cold War, would revolve around the same principle: to see the invisible, to listen to what the ocean reveals, and to act decisively on that knowledge. History remembers the dramatic battles, the sinkings, the heroes, and the losses. But the quiet revolution, the way sound itself reshaped the ocean, remains less visible, though no less decisive. It teaches that technological mastery can change the nature of warfare, that courage is inseparable from adaptation, and that even the deadliest weapon is vulnerable when the rules of engagement shift. In the end, the Atlantic proved that no darkness is absolute. Even beneath thousands of feet of water, the ocean could no longer hide its secrets. And for those who listened closely, it spoke with deadly clarity. The war beneath the waves had ended, not with spectacle, but with sound. And in that sound lay the promise of survival, victory, and a new understanding of the oceans themselves.